Stop scrolling because what happened in that hearing raised more than questions. It changed the entire tone of the room, and it started with a moment no one expected. For 67 seconds, everything went completely silent after Thomas Massie pressed play on a small recorder during what was supposed to be a routine review of Department of Justice budget allocations, a session that had followed the usual rhythm: measured exchanges, policy discussions, financial oversight, while Pam Bondi sat, composed with her legal team, appearing calm and in control, even briefly disengaged, until Massie leaned toward the microphone and quietly asked her to listen before posing his first question, instantly shifting the atmosphere as the recorder clicked and a voice filled the chamber stating that a transfer of $847,000 had been completed and verified with instructions not to post it elsewhere. Words that seemed to hang in the air as the room froze, Bondi remaining still while her lead attorney abruptly reacted, chair scraping and attention snapping back to the center of the exchange, as Massie calmly asked if she recognized the voice, and she responded with a measured refusal to confirm an unauthenticated recording in an open congressional setting, prompting him to acknowledge the response before introducing something he said could be verified, carefully opening a manila envelope and presenting a document to the camera, a bank wire transfer receipt, detailing a transaction dated February 8 from a Department of Justice financial management account to an entity named Executive Branch Consulting Services LLC in the exact amount of $847,000, complete with identifying account details and a signature at the bottom, turning what began as a standard hearing into a moment of intense scrutiny where every movement, every pause, and every unanswered question carried far more weight than the routine process that came before it. The signature, her handwriting, her name, sat at the bottom of the page as Thomas Massie placed the document on the table and asked plainly what legal services justified an $847,000 expenditure of public funds, and when no answer came, he reached back into the envelope, moving with deliberate calm as he introduced a second document, an internal Department of Justice memo dated February 11 outlining procedures for executive branch protection, highlighting a key line that classified all records tied to settlement agreement EP0225 as attorney-client privileged and exempt from FOIA, placing it beside the wire receipt before asking the central question of who exactly the client was in this situation, the department itself or someone else, drawing murmurs from the room before escalating further with a third document, an email from a Treasury analyst noting that the recipient entity had no employees, no physical address, and no verified business history, conditions that typically trigger mandatory suspicious activity reporting under federal law, only to reveal the supervisor's reply instructing them not to file because the subjects were categorized under an executive decision, prompting Massie to ask who made that call as Pam Bondi tightened her grip on the table while the chairman signaled for order and the room fell into a silence so complete that even the usual background noise disappeared, and instead of repeating himself, Massie simply began counting, 1, 2, 3 steady, and factual, not theatrical. As members slowly settled, reporters stopped typing, and cameras locked in, until he reached 67, marking a pause that carried more weight than any spoken reply, broken only briefly by another member urging Bondi to clarify the receipt, a request she met with silence, before Massie introduced yet another document, a DOJ privilege log obtained by court order, pointing to dozens of entries tied to the same matter 0225. All connected to a single payment, and as he turned the page, he read a notation referencing a J matter, repeating it and holding the page up to show it appeared again and again 16 times, before finally stating the name Jeffrey Epstein, freezing the room once more as Bondi's lead attorney invoked executive privilege, only for Massie to calmly note that such privilege protects communications with the president, not public treasury transactions or the bypassing of mandatory reporting requirements, leaving the hearing to continue, on paper but fundamentally altered in tone, as the unanswered questions surrounding the transfer, the privilege claims, and the documents lingered, underscoring that accountability doesn't always come through long speeches, but sometimes through records, silence, and a single question that never receives a clear answer, a moment defined by a wire receipt, a recording, and 67 seconds no one in that room is likely to forget. The hearing moved on, but the silence didn't stay behind. It followed everyone out of the room, lingering in the thoughts of committee members, in half-finished notes from reporters, and in one unanswered question: where did the $847,000 actually go? Thomas Massie had done more than create a moment. He laid out a pattern, a sequence that pointed beyond a single transaction, a recording not meant for public ears, a payment that drew no immediate challenge, a company with no clear footprint, and a directive that appeared to block a legally required report, none of which fits neatly into routine explanations. And what made it more striking was not open disagreement but the absence of it. Because if there had been a simple explanation, it likely would have surfaced right then. Instead, there was only quiet, and sometimes silence carries more weight than any statement, especially as Pam Bondi chose not to respond further, leaving the moment to speak for itself. At that point, the focus shifted from documents and recordings to what comes next, because when questions like these remain unresolved, they don't disappear, they build pressure. And history shows that unresolved pressure eventually forces a response somewhere, whether through new disclosures, further inquiry, or public attention spreading across platforms where people continue asking the same questions that weren't answered in that room, connecting the same elements, a payment, a privilege claim, a blocked report, and a name that changed the tone the moment it was spoken: Jeffrey Epstein. And once those pieces are in place, they don't simply fade, they demand clarification, which is why the real measure of accountability isn't what happens under the lights and microphones, but what follows afterward. Remember this the next time you see a headline about a speech or a hearing. What matters most is often not what was said, but what wasn't, and those 67 seconds are a reminder of that. If you followed the story this far, you already know it doesn't end in that room, because moments like this don't disappear, they evolve, turning from a single exchange into a timeline people begin to piece together: the transfer, the memo, the blocked report, the silence, each step connected, each detail adding weight, until a pattern starts to take shape that becomes harder to ignore the longer you look at it. And once patterns form, they don't just raise questions, they demand answers from every direction. From the offices that approved the movement of funds, from those who classified the records, and from those who stayed silent when clarity was expected, because accountability isn't one moment, it's a chain of decisions, and you can already see that chain forming in how the room shifted, how the questions changed, and how the silence still lingers. The longer that silence continues, the more people begin connecting details, shifting focus from what happened to who knew, who was aware before the transfer, who authorized the protections, who decided a required report wouldn't be filed. And those questions carry the kind of weight that can reshape entire narratives, because once they move beyond the hearing room, they're no longer controlled by schedules or microphones, they take on a life of their own, spreading across conversations, analysis, and public attention, creating pressure behind the scenes where decisions are made about what to reveal and what to hold back. And every one of those choices matters, especially when scrutiny is already building, because history shows that moments like this don't simply fade. They expand, they gain momentum, and eventually they force a response, leaving only one question still unanswered: when?